start the recording and then I'm going to share. All right. Arranging my screen with all these different little images here. Wonderful. Well, I have to say, just in preamble, I've been watching Abernethy Creek right out the door of the office. I'm at the office right now, and it's been a real education. I started with the council last April, and watching Abernethy Creek and the flux of that creek through the seasons. So it drops down to barely covering the rocks, and then we've had a couple of, pretty substantial rain events. I wouldn't call them extreme, but some pretty good rain events. And boy, the creek has come right up, and it's amazing. It moves quite a bit of wood. And then we had a big log jam that just about hit the bridge, not quite. And now that's down. It's still sitting there, but man, oh man, the creek is down. So it's
that is fun to watch.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah,
to be sure. Cool. All right. Well, I wish I had. I don't know if you remember at the zoo, I would play music at the beginning. I may have even asked you what kind of music you liked. So
yeah, I think that's right.
I ran that by Derek and Willow, but we didn't quite have an ability to play ambient music on the webinar, so it didn't quite work out as well. But it was fun in that room. That was nice. It gave it a good.
When we used to be in person and see people, and all these things are just so much more fun that way.
I think that we'll get back there at some point, but we're definitely hanging out for it right now. So, all right. Willow, you said 37 are signed up, and can you give me, do you have a good read on the number of participants that are in-house right now, Willow?
Yeah, it's 16 right now.
16, okay. Yeah, we'll give it a beat here. And I'd like to start pretty close to on time, but we'll give a couple minutes here for people to come into the room, so to speak.
Yeah.
Hey, I really enjoyed. We defended one of our OWEB proposals for the Beaver Lake Mumpano Dam presentation, and Joe Skalicki joined us, and he did a great job talking about lamprey. And
good.
I think it went pretty well. I mean, fingers crossed. That's one that Todd and I presented that together, and I feel like we did pretty well with it. But
good.
We'll
how soon will you find out something?
Not until April.
Okay.
So and we have one other proposal in for this particular round that we'll be reviewing. That is under review. So I got to present for that as well. But
great. Well, good. Well, hopefully it'll continue on the right path.
Yes. Yeah. I'd be so excited if that project would move forward. And I think just such great possibilities, but I appreciate your role in up to this point and getting us going with it.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Takes a village, as they say.
Truth. All right. Well, hey, what are we at right now, Willow?
21.
21. That's the lucky number. All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try this for a second, is spotlight for everyone. All right, so that should put me on camera in screen, and then Willow, can I confirm you can still see my presentation?
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah, I can should I shut off my camera for now?
That's entirely up to you. This will only be about 5 minutes. So, all right. Well, hey all, I want to welcome you to our first webinar as a part of the Watershed Wealth Webinar series. My name is Tom Gaskill, and I'm the Executive Director for the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council, and I'll be your host this evening for this. So we'll get started shortly with our featured presenter. First, I want to introduce a couple of folks that have been instrumental in pulling this together. Derek Palmore is our Stewardship Involvement Coordinator. I think, Derek, since I've got myself on the spotlight, let me remove the spotlight a second so people can see your smiling face. And Willow Michaels is our Community Outreach Coordinator. So Willow is should be on your screen as well to share there. All right, and Derek and Willow are both serving as AmeriCorps members through the Confluence Environmental Center, and we're very grateful for their participation in the council. And they've been working real hard to put this series together. So thank you, Derek and Willow. All right, let's see if I can get to the next slide. All right, so Greater Oregon City Watershed Council began in 2004. And just pin that for a second. And it was a dedicated core of volunteer board members that have been working to improve conditions in the watersheds in and around Oregon City for nearly 2 decades, which is remarkable. And we still have some of those founding members on the board, and I applaud them for their work. I myself have been working here just since April of last year, but remarkable work they have been doing. What kind of work is that? Well, the work that we do is in the areas shown on this map. So here we have the Abernathy Creek Basin and the Beaver and Parrot Creek Basins, and then some smaller creek systems that feed right into the Willamette above Willamette Falls, Abernathy down below Willamette Falls. And the work that we do is habitat restoration, invasive species removal, and restoration of native plants and wildlife. We also provide technical assistance, education and outreach, and stakeholder engagement. And tonight's program is supported by a community enhancement grant that was provided by our partners at the City of Oregon City and Metro. So we want to thank them for that. And if you are interested in learning more about these watersheds, I'll tell you more about that at the end of our presentation this evening, but we have another webinar coming up. All right. So after that quick introduction, I just want to share a couple of ground rules, and then I'm going to introduce our presenter. So I'd ask that you all stay muted for this. In fact, I will mute you with the exception of our presenter. And before we begin, if you'd like to type any questions that you have in the chat and I will provide them to Christina at the end of the presentation as time allows. But I'm going to leave the chat open right now because Christina has kind of a fun activity that she's going to engage us in. So you'll be able to type in the chat. Please stay around at the end of the presentation as we have more exciting information to share about upcoming opportunities to engage with our council. All right. So without further ado then, what I would like to do is introduce our presenter. Christina Wang. I met first when I was working at the Oregon Zoo on an exhibit highlighting the amazing Pacific Lamprey. Christina works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she brought such incredible enthusiasm to the topic of lampreys that I immediately became fascinated by these bizarre and remarkable creatures. And she continues to lead efforts to restore these ancient fish to former habitat through her leadership in the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative. So I'm honored to introduce Christina Wang as our presenter this evening. Thank you, Christina. And I'm going to stop my share now and let you take over the helm here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for that introduction.
All right. And move you to the spotlight.
Okay.
And it should, are you able to share there?
Yep, let's see here. I think we're almost there. How's that?
Great. Looking good. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you again, Tom. And thanks so much to the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council for inviting me tonight. And as Tom mentioned, I have a great passion for Pacific lamprey, all native lamprey species. So I'm really thrilled to be here to tell you about those, and specifically Pacific lamprey, the living fossil in our backyard. So this fun activity that Tom mentioned is, what do you think about lampreys? I know that there are a lot of different opinions about them. It's based on where you come from. It's based on what you've read in the media. It's based on a lot of different things. So as a fun activity, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind typing into the chat what you think about lampreys. Think about a word or a couple words that you would use to describe what you think about them. And we'll just take maybe a few, half a minute or so to do that. Let's see here. So we have super cool, ancient, scary soul suckers, squirmy, teeth, older than trees, old, really old, or actually old, really old. Anything else? Cute. Awesome. Eel-like, slimy. Perfect. Okay, well, those are very important observations, and they're kind of across the board. So I hope that from this talk, I'm going to challenge you to think about them in new ways moving forward. We're going to talk about a lot of different aspects about lampreys and their habitat and why they're important, and even why they're important in your specific area. So again, just keep that in mind. I hope to challenge you to think about them in new and different ways as we move through this presentation tonight. So let's get to know them a little bit better. So lampreys are very primitive relative to other fish. So they are in the class Agnatha, which is the jawless fishes. So you think of most fish and they have just, regular jaws. But if you look at this lamprey on here, it has no jaws. It has a sucker-like mouth, an eel-like body. They're not eels. That is a very common misperception, as people will say, well, are they eels? And they're not eels. Native American tribes call them eels, so I can see where it would be confusing. But if you look at a picture of an eel next to a lamprey, there are very stark differences, and the main one being that eels have jaws and lampreys do not. Another agnathan is the hagfish, which perhaps you've heard about. They're an abundant slime producing creature that also has kind of this elongated eel-like body. They have no scales. They're very smooth. They have cartilaginous skeleton, so no bones. They have no paired fins. They only have fins on the top of their body. They have dorsal fins. And there's about 40 species worldwide, which is, again, something that people are surprised about. There are both parasitic and non-parasitic species of lamprey, and there are anadromous, so the ones that go from fresh water to the ocean and back, and resident species of lamprey. So they're very interesting and primitive fish. They are an integral and founding part of the ecosystem. And this is where the title of this talk comes from, the living fossil in our backyard. So if you look at this timeline of when various creatures appeared in the evolutionary history, you can't believe it, actually, when lampreys came on the scene. So if you start on the very right, you see humans. We're just brand new babies to the earth, 100,000 years ago or so. Salmon appear in the fossil record about 6 million years ago. And then you have the age of the dinosaurs, which is really, as far back as a lot of people think. It's like, if it's the dinosaur age, then that's, as far as I can imagine. So before that, or really at the beginning of the dinosaurs, were sturgeon, and sturgeon look old. They have those really primitive and tough looking scales on them. But then if you go way to the left, we're looking at about 450 million years ago, and that's when lampreys appeared in the fossil record. This picture right here on this slide is an actual fossil of a lamprey that was discovered in South Africa, and it was a 360 million year old fossil. And it really, the body shape is the same, that suction mouth is the same. They really have a lot of the same appearance and feeding structures that really meant they were probably doing a lot of the same things behaviorally and looked a lot the same even about 400 million years ago. So it really is tremendous to think about that these animals that are hardly changed at all are still truly living in our backyards. They've been important to many cultures for many, many generations and really thousands of years. Indigenous cultures, both past and present, European cultures, Japanese cultures, and even the Queen of England is a lover of lamprey and celebrates her special occasions with lamprey pie. If you saw the Game of Thrones, you probably noticed that they talked about lamprey pie and they ate lamprey pie regularly. So it has been an important culinary tradition and a traditional and cultural tradition, especially for Indigenous people. So I mentioned there were 40 species of lampreys worldwide, and there's actually 10 species of lamprey occurring just in Oregon. So we really have a very high diversity of lampreys right here. There are anadromous varieties, there are parasitic types in Oregon. These are the 3 primary ones that we see. And with the names of them, I also have their average length as an adult. So we have the Pacific Lamprey on the right, which is the largest lamprey. It's anadromous and parasitic, and it gets to be about 32 inches long. So it's definitely the largest of all of the native lamprey species, or the lamprey species that we have in Oregon. The Western Brook lamprey is a resident lamprey species, and I'm going to describe the differences in their life cycle in just a minute. And that one only gets to be about 7 inches, so it's quite a bit smaller. And then there's the Western River lamprey, which gets to be about 12 inches. And that one is also anadromous and parasitic, just like the Pacific lamprey. So I'm going to describe to you just the basic differences in the life cycles between an anadromous and parasitic lamprey versus a resident lamprey. So let's start on the left for the anadromous and parasitic life cycle. And let's start on the right there at about 3 o'clock with a spawning adult. So the adults spawn, and I am going to describe this in more detail too when we specifically talk about Pacific lamprey, but I just want to share with you some of these very basic differences. So spawning adults spawn in the spring or summer, eggs hatch, and they turn into a larval phase. So we mostly call them larval lamprey. We also call them amicetes, although that term is going a little bit by the wayside, and we're focusing on calling them larval lamprey. Larval lamprey burrow in the river bottom for quite a length of time. Then they transform into the juvenile phase. And the juvenile phase in anadromous and parasitic lampreys, these are the ones that are migrating to the ocean. So they become parasitic juveniles in the ocean, and they spend a period of time in the ocean, and then they come back to freshwater and they spawn, and then they die. So that is the basic life cycle of an anadromous parasitic lamprey. A resident lamprey, if you start over there on the right at 3 o'clock, the spawning adults, they spawn, the eggs hatch, and they also start this larval phase, and they're a larval lamprey for a period of time, but then they completely skip that juvenile phase. They transform into an adult, and then they spawn, and then they die. So they really miss the resident species, don't go to the ocean, and they don't have that juvenile or parasitic phase. So it's quite a bit of a shorter life cycle, and of course, they're just staying in freshwater. So now I really want to focus our attention to the Pacific lamprey. Again, this as an adult, it's about 32 inches long. It's quite a large and muscular fish. And really the most important thing about Pacific lamprey is their importance to Native American tribes. They are considered a first food and a subsistence food for many Native American tribes. They're critically important to Native American families and culture. They are used for ceremonial purposes, for medicinal purposes. They've been used for generations. Some of these tribes, for as long as they can remember, they've had lamprey on their dinner, on their food tables, and at important family events. Elmer Crow is the person in the middle here who's holding the lamprey. And he said, the lamprey is our elder, and without him, the circle of life is broken. And that really is how they feel about Pacific lamprey. There's a lot of focus on salmon for Native American tribes, but the tribes that find Pacific lamprey to be important, they're just as important and sometimes even more important than salmon. So it's really this relationship with the tribes and with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies and state agencies. That's a large reason of why we do the conservation work that we do, is because of the importance to the tribes, how important Pacific lamprey are. It's considered a tribal trust species. And so we really have a responsibility to the tribes to help protect and conserve Pacific lamprey. So that would be the primary message that I want to tell you, is the importance of Pacific lamprey is culturally. The second really important thing about Pacific lamprey is their ecological importance. They're incredibly important to the ecosystem in which they belong. Salmon, trout, birds, mammals, crustaceans, humans, everybody eats them, as you can see on these pictures on the slide here. They're really high in fat content. They're much higher calorie count than salmon. So they're actually considered a predation buffer for salmon, meaning that sea lions and other creatures that may eat both lamprey and salmon might prefer to eat a lamprey instead, just because of the bang for the buck, so to speak, that they get from that really high fat content and calorie content. In the larval phase, they are an in-stream native alternative to earthworms. You can see in some of these pictures, in that larval phase, they actually do look like an earthworm, and they're buried in the bottom of the river. So they really serve that purpose as a food web base food item. Pacific lamprey have at least 46 known predators and 32 known prey species. So they have a varied diet, which has allowed them to last for 400 million years. They're not just depending on one thing that they eat. So that makes them very versatile, and I'm sure has allowed them to be on the earth for as long as they have. So beyond the food web, they contribute ecosystem services that are also very critical to their communities. And so let's look a little bit more closely at their life cycle, their behaviors, and the habitats that they're using, and how they truly are ecosystem engineers. So now a little bit more detail into their life cycle. Adult Pacific lamprey spawn in the spring or the summer, depending on where they are. And with their nest construction, spawning behaviors, they actually change and improve the cobble habitat that they spawn in. So this is a picture of the type of habitat that they spawn. If you've seen the type of cobble that steelhead spawn in, it's very similar. Oftentimes steelhead and Pacific lamprey are spawning in the same area using the same type of cobble habitat. Some studies at the University of Maine showed that sea lamprey spawning nests support greater macroinvertebrate abundance and potentially changes in macroinvertebrate communities from the physical and chemical changes to streams brought on by spawning populations of lampreys. So there's oftentimes large conglomerations of lamprey nests, and the eggs, the embryos, and those tiny newly hatched larvae are a rich food source for other aquatic species, including benthic invertebrates, drift feeding fishes, and even certain amphibians. So that the nest construction, the spawning behaviors, that movement of the sediment, the aeration of the sediment, all of these are contributing beneficial factors to the communities that they live in. So I have just a quick video here of adult Pacific lampreys spawning, and you can see how they use their suction mouth to suck onto the rock here, but then how they're fanning their tails to move the habitat around. So the male is wrapping around the female. And so you can see, so that movement, or bioturbation, it's called, is improving the benthic environment for all the other critters that live there. So larval lamprey burrow in the sediment for up to 10 years, if you can believe this. They filter feed during this time. This figure on the bottom shows how they're positioned and oriented in the substrate in the bottom of the river. So that filter feeding is also likely altering their habitat conditions. The feeding and burrowing behavior of lampreys increased oxygen levels. It maintains softness and increased abundance of fine particulate organic matter in and on the stream bed. So that burrowing behavior and them being there, filter feeding, it's cleaning the water. They're acting like earthworms. We think of earthworms as kind of farmers of the earth. And so you can look at larval lampreys as being kind of farmers of the underwater, doing that cleaning purpose and also just really maintaining a healthy stream bed. So this part is not so much ecosystem engineering as it is just part of the life cycle that's truly amazing. And it's the complete transformation from this larval or amiseed phase to the juvenile phase. So you see that top picture is a larval lamprey that really does look like an earthworm. And then look at the change that happens. It turns silver, it grows an eyeball, it grows a mouth, that digestive tract goes completely through. They stop being filter feeding. They change physiologically to handle, to go from freshwater to saltwater. So they make this really unbelievable transformation in 6 months. They do this from about July until December. And you electrofish for lamprey in July and you see all of these larval phase lampreys. And then you go back just a few months and you can see their transfer. First, their eyes spots come, and then their mouths and their teeth start forming. And then finally, they turn this kind of bright silver color. So it really is an amazing transformation to witness. They migrate to the ocean, and the ocean phase is one that has a lot of questions. The range you can see on that top picture is Pacific lamprey's native range is from Japan across the Pacific Rim all the way to Baja, California. So they are hatched in these freshwater streams, let's say in Japan or Russia or Alaska or Canada or Oregon. And then in their juvenile parasitic phase, they travel to the Pacific Ocean where they completely mix with each other. They may attach onto a host and travel across the entire ocean. They may stay close off of the coast of the United States. There was one Pacific lamprey that was tagged off the coast of Russia, which then was detected at Bonneville Dam and in the Deschutes River. So they don't go back to their home stream like salmon do. So their population really is a mixed population, which makes the management and conservation of them even more complicated. We're trying to learn more about the ocean phase. It's difficult just with the limitation on tags and the fact that they don't return to their natal stream makes it a little bit more difficult. But there's a picture on the bottom there showing a lamprey parasitizing a fish in the ocean. And as I mentioned earlier, just the wide range of hosts that they're able to parasitize really helps them, especially when we're talking about threats like climate change and the potential movement and changing of ranges of host fish. If they can be a little bit versatile in that area, they're going to do a lot better. So once they complete their ocean phase, they sexually mature and they into adults, and they return to freshwater, again, not necessarily their home stream. They are conditioned to pay attention to pheromones of larval lamprey. So they smell and they seek out the scent of rearing larval lamprey, and that tells them that must be a good place to spawn because there's already larval lamprey rearing there, so it must be a healthy environment. So they come back and they spawn, like salmon, adult Pacific lampreys die after spawning, and of course delivering much needed marine derived and other nutrients to the stream. And that is their final contribution as ecosystem engineers. So this is a photo of Pacific lamprey scaling Willamette Falls in 1913. And this is a picture that we often show to show the difference in abundance of Pacific lamprey 100 years ago versus what we see now. So this is still a harvest location for the tribes in the Pacific Northwest, and it's really one of the only sites that still have enough lampreys to harvest. So lampreys have threats everywhere they occupy. There are passage impediments, culverts, large-scale passage impediments like hydroelectric dams, habitat degradation, urbanization, poor water quality, predation, climate change, lack of awareness, specifically lack of awareness of the importance of lampreys and the misperception that native lampreys harm salmon and other important fishery resources. So this is an image. I mean, lamprey wounds probably aren't pretty to see on a fish, but native lampreys have co-evolved with their hosts. They attach to them, they take the nourishment that they need, and then they drop off and they go to another one. So this is very different from the invasive sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. And so we have a lot of negative media attention and misperceptions about that one species of invasive lampreys in the Great Lakes and how that gets applied to our native lampreys here. And even sea lamprey are native to the Atlantic Ocean. So it really is just this one, it's this native species of lamprey that has invaded the Great Lakes that has really created a lot of bad public relations issues for lamprey species in general. So this going away from this negative media coverage and misperceptions of these invasive lampreys is definitely a major threat and a focus for us. So people often wonder about climate change, and climate change certainly is affecting, it will and is probably already affecting aquatic species, including lampreys. So this figure is a figure from a paper that we worked on originally from Hughes 2000, who looked at the impacts potentially from climate change on community structure. So we took this model and used it to look at specifically how climate change might be impacting lamprey species and global lamprey species. So if you look at this figure, you can see climate change can affect physiology. So that's going to affect metabolism, growth, the metamorphosis. I talked to you about this complete transformation that lampreys make. So imagine if these physiological changes have a temperature cue or a flow, a time of year cue. Imagine climate change may be affecting those physiological changes. Effects on phenology or the timing of life cycle events. That's very clear to see earlier hatching potentially, migration timing shifts, which could really spell a lot of trouble for lamprey species. Effects on distribution. I mentioned just the host availability. So if there's effects on distribution of those host fish or effects on distribution for lampreys, those shifts, they might not match up anymore. And so there's definitely going to be some effect on from climate change potentially on distribution. And then if you look farther down, I'm not going to go over every detail in this, but obviously once you have changes in lamprey species, then you're going to have changes in species interactions. These are animals that interact with a lot of other different species, just in their burrowing, in their feeding, in a lot of their life cycle. So there's going to be changes in species interactions. And then what follows after that is changes in community structure and composition. So the ecosystem services that they provide and how they benefit bacterial and macroinvertebrate communities. What if lampreys aren't there to do that? That's going to change those communities. And then thinking about human culture, we talked about the importance of lampreys to humans. You know, what happens if climate change completely shifts distribution or worse, wipes them out, and then human communities who depend on them really are going to have a great loss. So the two final things I want to point your attention to on here, though, is lamprey vulnerability and the effects from climate change working synergistically with other threats. There's a lot of other threats that I mentioned that are affecting lampreys. And when those get together and work synergistically, it really is a magnifying effect. And that, you know, especially with the altered river systems that we have now, it really is creating a much worse environment. Finally, on the right, I also wanted to point out lamprey resiliency. Clearly, they're tolerant. They're very adaptable. They've been here for 400 million years. They've made it through multiple mass extinction events. They're widely distributed. And really some information on temperature tolerance has found that they are quite tolerant to elevated temperatures. When we're talking relative to, say, bull trout or animals that have a really narrow range of temperature tolerance, I'm not saying you can throw a lamprey into, hot water and have it, be happy and swimming, but it may be able to tolerate a little bit more temperature change than some of our very narrow species that can't handle those changes. So the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative is a consortium of tribal, federal, state, local partners working together on the conservation of Pacific lamprey from Alaska to California. So the US historical range of Pacific lamprey. So it's the goal of the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative to reduce threats and to get back to the photo at Willamette Falls showing the really abundant lampreys there and get back to a point where tribes can harvest there every year without worrying about it. So the Lamprey Initiative was started in 2008, and it was started because of concern from the tribes. It was an integration of many tribal and agency plans. There were already conservation efforts going on at that time, and this was really an idea to have an umbrella over a lot of these existing efforts to bring them together and to have coordination. At that time, there were relatively few people specifically working on lamprey conservation. Of course, the tribes were, but really the amount of people working in lamprey conservation has ramped up tremendously in the last 20 years. So at the time when this started, it was to preserve people resources, financial resources, all of the resources that we worry about in watershed health and conservation. So pooling those resources to work together to collaboratively restore Pacific lamprey, with the goal of achieving long-term persistence and supporting traditional tribal cultural use. So as part of the Lamprey Initiative, we arranged ourselves into regional management units. And I have here a picture on the left. We have 18 regional management units all the way from Alaska to Southern California. And then on the right, I have kind of a blow up of the Willamette subunit it's called the Willamette Lower Columbia Regional Management Unit. And so this is showing the current and historical distribution of Pacific lamprey. So the current is in blue and the red is the historical distribution. And we have a very handy database. It's called the Lamprey Data Clearinghouse. And we have a fairly user-friendly database that you can go and find out what occupancy data we have for Pacific lamprey in a lot of different streams. So if you live on a particular stream, you could go to our data clearinghouse and see if there have been lampreys sampled and if we actually have occupancy data for lampreys. So it is pretty handy, and it's handy not only for your own interest, in your own neighborhoods, but also if you're working on a restoration project, for instance, like the Watershed Council, and we may be embarking on a restoration project, and it's really important to look and see what is there, where lampreys are, because if you're scheduling in-stream restoration work and you have those larval lampreys burrowing there, you could be really affecting them without even knowing it. So we really encourage people to go and look at the data clearinghouse to find this information. Sorry about that. So once we arranged ourselves into these regional management units, we did an assessment, and we've done 2 assessments so far, 2011 and 2017. And this assessment is the risk of extirpation, or the risk of extinction. And so it takes into account population demographic information like population size, short-term trend, like where we think the population is going, current distribution versus historical distribution, and if there's changes, based on what we used to see, what's currently going on. So a lot of population demographic information, and then also threats. So that information is put together, and it comes out with a relative risk of extinction. And so I have on here, these are the areas of the Willamette and Lower Columbia Regional Management Unit and what the risk shows for those areas. So you see most of them are critically imperiled some imperiled. The Clackamas is actually listed as vulnerable, which is the one that's in the best shape. But you can see across the board, and if you look at this map in general, the red and dark orange is showing the more imperiled hucks, or these geographic units, and then the greens and the yellows are showing a little bit less risk. But there's not, green secure areas all throughout the range, implying that there's a lot of rescue populations. There's a lot of threats impacting Pacific lampreys throughout the US range. So, and some of you might be interested in joining the regional management unit. So I just wanted to show you some of the information that we're collecting. And this is good timing for this talk because we're actually going through our third iteration of the assessment in 2022. So the regional management units are getting together in this for spring, late winter and spring, and they're coming together and they're discussing new threats that have been identified in the watersheds. And there's some examples of the threats that we're looking at on the top of the tables on these next two slides, this one and the next one. So looking at flow alterations, stream and floodplain degradation, water quality, predation, and I'll show you the next one. So the participants in those regional management units, they discuss threats, they discuss ongoing projects, conservation projects, needed actions, needed research and conservation actions in the regional management unit. And then they put that information into the assessment, and we publish that every 5 years. So if you go to the next one here, so dam-related passage, dam-related flow alterations. Some geographic areas have more dams and some don't. And so we found it important to kind of separate those threats into dam-related passage versus non-dam-related passage and flow alterations. So I'm only showing you the primary threats that are identified. We have other threats like climate change, predation, lack of awareness, small effective population size. So those groups come together and they discuss all of these and they rank how well the Pacific lampreys are doing related to those threats. And then again, that information gets put into the risk assessment. So it really is useful, and we're trying to do this every 5 years so that we can see what, we're having a lot of on the ground restoration, research projects. We're really trying to get a handle on what impact we are making and how it's actually changing the status of Pacific lamprey in these areas, and if it's changing their risk of extinction. So Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative partners are working on a lot of different projects to restore native lamprey species. So passage modification, and this picture on the top left is something called a vertical wetted wall. Sometimes the best way to fix a passage barrier is to just have lampreys go up and over. And we're lucky in the fact that Pacific lampreys can actually climb. They're really one of the only species that can climb straight up. All you need to do is to provide a smooth surface and a constant stream of water, and they can swim into that structure on the top left there and swim straight up and over the barrier. So that has been a very useful type of restoration, type of passage improvement that we've been able to make in a lot of different places. That's relatively inexpensive also, as long as you can get permission to attach a structure like this. It really is a fairly economical way to improve passage without having to completely modify a fish ladder, especially when those fish ladders are passing Endangered Species Act salmon, and the passage can't be degraded for those listed species. So passage modifications, and also the picture on the right, really changing those culverts, perched culverts that lampreys have a lot of trouble getting into, and changing those to natural stream bottom culverts or bridges, which is also, obviously the best fix probably for all aquatic species is creating a natural passageway that they can pass through. Translocation programs, the picture on the top middle is a young person in the Yakima Basin releasing Pacific lamprey. So the several tribes have translocation programs And if you recall me talking about the pheromone signal and lampreys needing that to be able to return to healthy areas to spawn where they know that larval lampreys are rearing, the tribes are very, very concerned that they're losing that signal. So as these populations are going extinct and extirpated, they're leaving those areas, then even if the habitat is fantastic, the pheromone signal is not going to be there. And so they're probably not going to return. And so they have translocation programs where they collect them at a dam or a certain location, and then they keep them over the winter, and then they put them out the following spring to spawn. And they've had quite a lot of success in boosting the larval abundance and the nest abundance and the larval lamprey abundance and those juvenile lamprey migrating out. So outreach programs, partners have really been focusing on outreach programs. That is actually a picture on the bottom right of the zoo exhibit. Perhaps some of you have been able to visit the zoo and see the Pacific Lamprey exhibit that Tom was referring to. We were so excited to be able to work with the zoo on that exhibit and just bring, like he said, the remarkable, bizarre, crazy creatures that these are to the zoo to discuss and share the cultural importance and the evolutionary history of them. They really have been a great addition, I think. And one thing that I'm sorry I failed to mention earlier in their life cycle, which is a really important part, which actually makes the zoo exhibit possible, is they have this overwintering phase. So when they remember the life cycle, when they come in from the ocean and before they spawn and die, they actually overwinter for about a year or more. And during this time, they're not eating at all, if you can imagine that. They come in from the ocean, they hunker down, and they overwinter, and they don't eat a thing. They're just sexually maturing, they're getting ready to spawn, they're losing about 30% of their mass. So they shrink, they go from 32 inches and they shrink way down. Well, exhibits like the Oregon Zoo is able to take advantage of that kind of dormant situation. They don't need to feed them. They're just kind of hunkered down anyway. So they're very happy to be in a safe tank like this. And so it's a really great collaboration with the tribes who are in their translocation programs. They are overwintering these adult lampreys, waiting for them to spawn. So a few of them hang out at the zoo, and then the tribes come back to collect them, and then they return them to the spawning ground where they can fulfill their destiny as parents and die and return those marine derived nutrients to the stream. And then the bottom picture is a holistic restoration project. One of our goals with the initiative partners is to get people to include lampreys into salmonid focused restoration projects. And that's why we are so thankful for the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council and other groups like yours who are willing to learn about lamprey, willing to include them in your projects, because it really does make for a better ecosystem for all the reasons that I told you about. Including lampreys just does so much for the ecosystem and the communities. So really focusing not on species specific restoration techniques, but really these holistic ecosystem restoration techniques is just makes it better for everybody. So these are examples of some of the projects that initiative partners have been working on. So the Lamprey Initiative and the Fish and Wildlife Service specifically are super excited to work with the Watershed Council on the Beaver Lake Mompano Dam project and incorporate some of the modifications that have been utilized for other passage barriers, rounding corners like this top picture. And here's another type of climbing structure. So just doing some of those, just even in communication with Tom and with Todd and other members of the Watershed Council, it's just been so great to hear that they're really focusing on lamprey and getting that holistic ecosystem approach going. And it sounds like future talks, perhaps in your webinar series, may focus on more specific passage issues and potential fixes for lampreys. So that will be super interesting if you decide to go down that road. So finally, just a couple of things as I'm ending up here. I want to make sure that you're aware of the Lamprey Information Exchange webinar schedule. This is our 5th annual Lamprey Information Exchange. This is a meeting that used to be in person. It's now shifted to a webinar series. We're all familiar with that. It's the second Tuesday of each month from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time. Those first two are crossed out because they've already happened. February 8th is Lampreys and Climate Change. So that's just this coming Tuesday. March 8th is Lamprey Passage, which might be of interest to you. April 12th is Restoration, Entrainment, and Salvage of Lampreys. And then finally, we're going to finish up this year's webinar series on May 10th with supplementation and disease. So if you would like more information about that, please email info@pacificlamprey.org, and the initiative coordinator will certainly send you the webinar registration links or any other information that you'd like. So my final thing here, and I'm not going to read all this, but when Tom and Willow and Derek and I were talking about the talk tonight, we talked about making available resources that we have within the Lamprey Initiative. And I literally have 5 pages of resources here: Lamprey regional plans and general information, Lamprey education and outreach, summary documents like best management guidelines during in-water work, culvert, fish or street crossings, habitat restoration guide, climate change vulnerability assessments. I mean, the list goes on. So I will share a kind of hyperlinked document that with them so that they can share it with you, and that you can have access to a lot of really great work that's going on for lamprey conservation. And I would be remiss not to mention freshwater mussels. We also have a bunch of links for mussels, so those will be included as well. Now that lampreys are not as much of an underdog species, they still are, but now we got to turn our attention to help our friends, the freshwater mussels as well. So finally, I'd like to thank you again. Thank you for listening and helping us raise awareness for how important lampreys are. This is a poster that is the best thing from the Oregon Zoo. It was a marketing poster talking about the cuteness of lampreys. So with that, thank you very much. And thank you to the Watershed Council, specifically Tom and Derek and Willow, and of course the Lamprey Initiative, all the partners I work with there, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So thank you very much.
Hey, Christina, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful job. And it's amazing. I mean, the amount of information about lamprey and also just the excitement around it. I think people are really kind of fired up. We've got a lot of great questions in the chat. And folks, you can continue to do that if you want to throw more questions into the chat. I love that image. The cuteness is coming. I'm glad that you put that
it's the
up
best.
there.
It was so great. And it was attached. It was next to, and obviously, Tom, you know this, but for others, it was next to the picture of the red panda, which was also a new inhabitant at the zoo. And so it was like, red pandas clearly are very adorable. And then it was like this tongue-in-cheek thing. Well, we're cute too. So they were right next to each other, which was so great.
In the biologist side, that is one cute fish right there. Hey, I want to mention, Derek pointed out that we'll send out these resources that Christina highlighted, the toolkit at the end with the evaluation. So we'll make sure that you have that available to you participants. There's lots of great stuff in there. I want to dig into the questions. We've got about 10 minutes, not quite left. And I'm also going to place a couple of resources in the chat while you were talking, Christina. Derek found a close look at the current assessments through the Fish and Wildlife Service page. So I'm going to put that in the chat while you're answering a question. But first, I'm going to throw a question at you that we've got here in the chat. And there were a couple that were interesting to me personally. Can you describe the differences in parasitic behavior between the non-native lamprey in the Great Lakes Atlantic region and Oregon's native lampreys?
Sure, that's a great question. And that's one of the issues that we have, is that because the invasive sea lampreys in the Great Lakes were not co-evolved with the ecosystem there, they went in and completely ravaged the lake trout population and other fishery resources there. So you would see, if you look up sea lamprey wounds, Great Lakes sea lamprey wounds, you will see a lake trout that has 10 wounds on it. well, no fish can survive that, right? So you just, I mean, the population boomed. The hosts there didn't really know what to do with it because they're not co-evolved with them. And so they're very aggressive just because of numbers and just multiple sea lampreys attaching to one fish. Now native parasitic behavior on hosts that have become accustomed to it, they may have one fish. And again, it hooks on and it eats what it wants and then it drops off. And if that fish is not compromised, it's going to be fine because it's used to it, honestly. So it's very different. Just and that's in talking more broadly about invasive species. That's the issue with invasive species, right? They come into a system that's not prepared for them. And so the parasite is able to be very aggressive and very destructive.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great kind of description of difference. And as a flatlander by birth and someone who grew up on the shores of Lake Michigan, I can attest to the fact that the lamprey, you couldn't swim in the lake. They were so thick. No, that's not true.
Yep.
Sorry, that's a big lie. But I do remember the lamprey, and alewives was another one that was another fish that did not belong in the Great Lakes. But
yep.
Our next question is very sciencey. Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service do any subcutaneous pit tags or other type of tracking projects on lampreys currently?
They sure do. So a lot of our partners do, specifically for the tribal translocation program. So there are pit tags. So for people who aren't familiar with pit tags, it's like they call it RFID, right? It's like a tag that if you implant it under the skin, so subcutaneous, and then it goes up to a detection array. And it can be passively, it's called a passive detection tag. And so the dams, mouths of certain rivers are wired up with these detection arrays. And so we are able to tag them and find out the migration timing. We're able to find out where they're going. Again, it's difficult because they're not returning to their home stream. But that fish that I told you about that was tagged, that was a pit tag tagged in Russia that then was detected by one of these pit tag arrays at Bonneville Dam and at the mouth of the Deschutes River. So yes, there is a very wide ranging pit tag program for lampreys, certainly not rivaling the hatchery salmon tagging program, but I mean, it's getting to the point where a lot, now people are working with artificial propagation of lampreys, not for hatchery purposes, but for conservation purposes. And so those lampreys are tagged. So yes, there is a large scale effort with pit tagging. And we also now have these acoustic tags also for lampreys. So yes, there's a large scale tagging effort going on.
Wonderful. I think this is a whole nother topic, and fortunately I got to participate in the eDNA webinar that was given recently, but at some point, hopefully folks can learn a little bit about that, because that leg of science is a very interesting one too for discovering distribution of these animals. But I want to stick to script here. We've got a few more questions. This one may need some clarification. What is the range in egg production for Pacific lamprey?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So if you're talking about the range of eggs that are laid, perhaps maybe tell me if this is not what you're talking about, like the fecundity or the number of eggs laid by female Pacific lampreys. It's astounding. So it's actually 100,000 to 300,000 eggs per female, which is a lot. So they're highly fecund, we call them. So and they will spawn, like that spawning video that I showed you, they will do that with multiple partners in multiple nests for a period of time, until they're too tired and spawned out and they die. So, but they will go kind of from nest to nest and spawn with multiple partners until they've, released hundreds of thousands of eggs.
Wow, remarkable. I mean, these creatures, there's a reason why they've been around for 400 million years over.
Yeah. Yeah, over. I mean, everything that you talk about them, it's like, oh, well, that's why. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, they do that. Well, that's why. And they
Yeah.
do that. And that's why. You know, they're genius animals, really.
Well, hey, I think a couple of more quick questions, and because we could keep going on here, and then I think we're going to wrap up with a little more information about next steps for the council. But
Yep.
this one's probably been asked of you before, Christina, but what is your favorite aspect of the Pacific Lamprey?
Oh my gosh, that's such a hard question. That's a hard question. So I'm gonna give two quick answers because I'm not sure which angle you're going for, but I have two answers. So and this is kind of a cop out because their blue eyes, you have this very like brown and aggressive looking fish with all the teeth, and then they have these beautiful blue eyes
Nice.
that really draw people in and help with the conversion of of really loving lampreys. So that's the physical attribute that I find
Isn't
very interesting.
that's like captured in, isn't macrothalame? Doesn't that mean like big eye?
Big eye,
Yeah.
big eye. Yep, exactly.
Nice.
So I
Nice.
think that's the neatest physical trait. Now I'm going to get a little bit I don't know how do you say this. Lampreys really bring people together, and I think this is my actual favorite thing about lamprey. So my career has only been with lamprey. I've worked for 20 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I've only worked with native lamprey species. I have never been in a more I've worked in other fish in my career, but most specifically, I've worked with lamprey this entire time. So I have experience working with other fish and in other groups as well. Never has there been a more welcoming and open and kind group of people who really want to conserve these species that kind of have negative PR issues. And they have, never have you met a more enthusiastic, engaged group of people who want to work together for a common goal. And so that, I think, is my favorite thing about them is, you can't do natural resource conservation by only thinking about the animals, right? It's the people too. And so I really think lampreys bring out the best in people, especially when they learn about them and are amazed by them. So that's probably my favorite.
Well, this last question, I think, is just simply, do you think that Pacific lamprey populations are headed towards endangered species status?
So they were listed in 2000, or sorry, they were petitioned to be listed in 2003. There was 4 species of lampreys, and the Pacific lamprey is the only one that even got to the 90-day finding because of lack of information. So the whole reason for the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative is to do what we call this proactive conservation, kind of in lieu of listing. So we have made a lot of progress. So I think it's the hope of the Fish and Wildlife Service that the Fish and Wildlife Service is contributing a lot of people, resources, and money to this effort that now has been going on since 2008. And really outside of the regulatory impacts of ESA, we're able to do a lot. So I can't say for sure. I think it's still not fast enough. Like, we're still not doing enough. We still have so much work to do. But I think we're making a dent. And so I'm not sure, but I hope that we're making enough of a dent that we don't have to go down that road.
Hear, 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 hear. Well, Christina, thank you so much. I'm going to take back screen sharing here for a second and just get us over. Let's see. Let me get over here. All right. Hopefully you can all see that. So our next webinar in the series is March 1st. So what is today? February 1st. So 1 month from today. 6:30 to 7:30, and it's called From Ridgetop to the Willamette River, Introduction to the Greater Oregon City Watersheds. Can't beat that, with John Runyon and Todd Alsbury, 2 people who've been around this watersheds for a couple decades, and they really know and have a great deal to share with us. And they've done a recent assessment of the Abernathy Creek watershed, and they'll be sharing some exciting information from that, and also kind of a 101 about the work that we're doing here. I want to remind you you will be sent an evaluation of tonight's webinar, and that gives you an opportunity to share with us what you'd like to see in future webinars, which is very important. We want to listen to you, and we want to make sure this is important to you and that you get what you want out of it. And then finally, I want to highlight that the Watershed Council is now doing some active on the ground kinds of things that you can get involved in. So Willow and Derek both are heading up efforts, and we have events scheduled in March and April. So if you want to learn more about that, you can look at our website. You can look at our Facebook, which Willow manages to post information about upcoming events. And we have a couple of really exciting sites that we're working with right now. Up at the Clackamas Community College, John Inskeep Environmental Learning Center, and also at Abernathy Creek Park, which is just down the street from our office, which is new. Yes, we have an office in Oregon City. So fun stuff there. And then I think that is all. So thank you for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Relax, and we hope that we see you at a future webinar. So thank you for coming. Appreciate your time, and take care. See you later.